Good afternoon. I will call this House Housing, Finance and Policy Committee to order and note that their quorum is present. Representative Agbaje, have you had a chance to review the minutes?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
The minutes are moved. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Minutes are approved. Members, we have 4 bills up today, and first up we have House File 647 of Representative Hassan's. Representative Hassan, would you like to move your bill?
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hassan moves House File 647. I understand you have an author's amendment. Would you like to move and explain your amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chair. The A2 amendment is just adding taking consideration into the pandemic and adding that if somebody lost their job during the pandemic and they get affected, that is an automatic expungement.
Any discussion to the amendment? Lee Johnson.
Chair Howard, that amendment is not in our packets. No.
Hold for a second. Members, we're going to print that amendment. We're not. So what I'd suggest is that we'll take presentation on the bill, but we're not going to move and act on that amendment until members have a chance to see it. Sorry about that, Representative Johnson. Representative Hassan, if you could present your bill.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. And members, for the opportunity to present House File 647, which is an act relating to housing, expanding the eligibility for discretionary and mandatory expungement for eviction case court files. House File 647, if made law, will be transformational in helping balance the power between tenants and landlords. Landlords write the leases. We need state law to ensure tenant protections. The simple filing of an eviction action by a landlord appears immediately on tenant's records before the court has rendered a judgment or even heard the case. It appears indefinitely on the renter's record as an eviction and is reported by tenant screening agencies for the next 7 years, whether an eviction was warranted or not. What House File 647 does is very simple. It allows the court to order the expungement of an eviction if someone's record, if the court determines the eviction is no longer a reasonable predictor of future behavior, if the defendant wins their case, if the case is dismissed, if the parties have agreed to an expungement, if the eviction is more than 3 years old, and if the case is settled and the defendant fulfills the terms of the settlement. We all know the data. We have heard it over and over that our eviction filings are skyrocketing and our families are being left to be homeless. According to research, people facing homeless evictions are, highest risk of evictions are low-income women with young children, and followed by domestic violence victims. Families who are affected regularly lose their possessions, lose their jobs, and experience higher rates of depression. For children, the instability by eviction can result in worse outcomes in education, health, and future earnings. With that, Mr. Chair, I have few testifiers, and then we'll stand for questions and hopefully deal with the amendment.
Thank you. Up first, we have Rachel Sterling with Homeline Housing, with Homeline. And I would ask testifiers if they could keep comments to 2 to 3 minutes. That would be appreciated. And I see that this is not Rachel Sterling. So please introduce yourself for the committee and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Chair. I have aged. I'm Larry McDonough. I'm a policy attorney with Homeline, and Rachel could not be here, so I'm just going to try to fill her shoes. For a brief introduction, I've been a housing attorney for 39 years, represented over 10,000 tenants and landlords over the years, and I've been a landlord myself. So what this bill does is a couple of things. It increases the opportunities for the courts to expunge. It Right now, the expungement statute has a fairly narrow category of what are mandatory expungements. They're focused on, essentially it goes back to cases that were coming up during the foreclosure crisis. And then there's a permissive expungement section. So what this does is increases the number of mandatory expungements to cases where, for instance, the tenant won or the cases are fairly old. And it also expands the court's authority to look at expungement from a permissive standpoint if, for instance, an old case is not really a predictor of how a tenant might function at this point. It also would make evictions private records until there is an outcome. And so the last thing is something that the courts experimented with in the earlier parts of the expungement, having cases being private until there was an outcome, and that worked well. I can say from a landlord standpoint that nothing in this bill would hurt me. I have the ability to screen for tenants, as I always have. But what this is attempting to do is to clear the records of tenants so that they're not punished kind of repeatedly over time for a problem that they had in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Nancy Etzweiler with the Volunteer Lawyers Network. Ms. Etzweiler, welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much. I'm a retired 3M attorney, and since I retired a number of years ago, I've represented dozens of clients through Volunteer Lawyers Network, and specifically clients who are seeking to expunge their eviction records. And so I wanted to speak in support of the bill, really to offer examples and paint a picture of how these cases come up, where clients are unjustly saddled with an eviction record, as well as describe the impact of eviction records on my clients. And it has been mentioned, as soon as a case is filed, the record becomes publicly accessible, regardless of whether the tenant actually wins, the case is pursued, the case is filed but not served, or a case is settled and the landlord continues to rent to the tenant happily. The tenants still are saddled with this eviction record. And as at least one county in Minnesota has found, only 2 out of every 7 cases actually winds up with an eviction order. There's so many circumstances that arise that we have many cases. For example, I had a client who was on a lease with her sister. She got the written, she approached the landlord and wanted to leave the landlord in writing, took her off the lease, but nonetheless added her name to an eviction filing a few months later when the sister couldn't pay the rent. My client didn't even know she had an eviction record until about a year later when she was trying to rent elsewhere and found out no one would rent to her. She and her daughter wound up without any housing and living on couches for a while. I had a client with a severe disability who was attacked in the apartment building, and the landlord, rather than calling the police or managing it, filed eviction cases against both tenants, my client and the assaulter, rather than deal with it, and he was left with an eviction record. I had a 14-year-old who was listed in an eviction record because the landlord listed her along with her mother, so we had somebody not even out of 9th grade with an eviction record. And many of my clients have a short-term problem, can't pay, an eviction case is filed, but then they settle through the process with the landlord, fully complete the settlement, and in fact continue to be rented to by the landlord. Yet, because the records are visible, before there's an order entered, they still are saddled with an eviction record. And so the impact on families who have these is heartbreaking and really deeply damaging. So many clients wind up not being able to find any affordable housing. They wind up sleeping in their cars. They sleep and couch surf between friends and family, often far from the children's schools, far from their support network. It's very hard to hold a job if you're sleeping in your car or sleeping on someone's couch. You don't have access to laundry, showers, keeping, transportation often. And the emotional tolls on family is severe. So to conclude, there are tenants who are just not able to pay the rent, and the public absolutely does have a right to know about them for a reasonable amount of time. But there are many, many cases in which an eviction order was never entered. So HF 647 really offers a fair balance, requiring an actual eviction order to be entered before saddling anybody with the heartbreaking impacts on families of having a publicly available eviction record. And so I urge your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Leanna Stefaniak, Vice Chair with Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. Welcome to the committee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Leanna Stefaniak, and I am the incoming board chair for the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association. I've also worked in the multifamily industry for nearly 20 years, working with market rate units, NOAA units, and affordable housing units. I'm here today to respectfully highlight some concerns with the major expansion of the eviction record expungement proposed in House File 647. Evictions are often a last resort. They are expensive and a disruption to the business and residents. Minnesota's eviction filing rate is the lowest in the country, or one of the lowest in the country. And we know this because of the data the eviction record provides. This data also tells us what types of evictions are filed, who are the most frequent filers and perhaps abusing the eviction process, and also renters with a history of bad behavior. The elimination of this data through the significant expansion of the eviction record expungement would provide less public scrutiny for the actions of renters and housing providers alike. This bill would also allow most records to be expunged immediately after a court reaches a conclusion or a case is settled. After 3 years, 100% of eviction records would be expunged regardless of the circumstances which gave rise to the eviction action in the first place. These actions, the eviction records offer insight to whether a building fits the needs of a prospective resident. They are one of many factors a landlord considers when looking at a renter application. Failing to properly screen applicants harms other renters, sets the other renter up for failure, and could be a financial and legal liability for public and private housing providers. An additional concern is the language in the proposal permits the courts to determine an eviction action is no longer a reasonable predictor for tenant behavior. That language leaves substantial room for interpretation. Courts are not operators of rental units and are not equipped to determine what creates a reasonable predictor of tenant behavior. When looking at expungements and other areas of law, there are procedures in place that must be followed to meet that standard of no longer a reasonable predictor. But this statute provides no such obligations or guidelines. Similarly, a tenant prevailing on the merits could include a large range of outcomes well short of a dismissal in the renter's favor. For instance, it could include a court ordering a nominal decrease in the amount of rent owed, but still issuing the rent of recovery for the housing provider. Finally, allowing an expungement by agreement between the parties without the action of whether this information is to the public interest, sometimes often for financial compensation, allows two parties to control the fate of public record to the detriment of others. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you. And now, I believe members do have a copy of the A2 amendment. I'm wondering if Representative Hassan want to do again, just briefly describe the A2 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment just adds on the language for during the pandemic, if you lost your job and you couldn't pay, that it's an automatic expungement. And then it has the dates of March 13, 2020, and to September 30th of 2022.
Any discussion to the amendment? Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, Representative Hassan, I understand what you're trying to do with this expungement, but I would suggest when it goes to judiciary, I have an amendment to change on line 1.4 to may. I've been on judiciary just about my entire time in the legislature, and the courts do not like being told what they have to do. In fact, we cannot tell them what they have to do. So to make this in line, I would suggest putting may in there the next time, but other than that, I have no problems with the amendment.
Representative Nash.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the author. is there a local impact note or a cost? Because the courts are going to have to go back and do this, and that's obviously going to incur some cost, and yet I don't see that in the bill. I'm just wondering is there a note that's lagging, as we've seen, or never been requested, or where might we be on that? Because to do this, obviously, some of it will be retroactive. I'm just curious as to how that'll be accomplished.
Representative Hassan or Mr. Dahl?
Mr. Chair, Representative Nash, there was a fiscal note asked for in the last biennium and it came up with a 0. This is essentially the same bill, and there was no cost before.
Representative Nash.
Well, I want to write that down, that the court said that it won't cost anything. I think that's great, because I don't believe it, but yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
Representative Nash. Representative Nash has the floor.
I'll be done. I just think that I have a hard time believing that having to go back and retroactively edit this out of records will have a 0 cost, because there will be staff time that's associated with that. I don't know that it can be done electronically where you just simply find a part of the database that has this aspect populated and you now remove them. I don't think that happens. So I'm sure there will be a cost associated with that.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, I believe Representative Nash is correct, because if I recall on those in the system, it doesn't say if it's eviction for under one statute or another statute, it's just eviction, so they're going to have to go through every record by hand.
See, are there any further discussion to the A2? Representative
Mr.
Hassan?
Chair,
Yeah.
I was just going to say that we'll double check. I think we did, request that fiscal note, and it was 0, and we'll check with fiscal staff again.
Representative,
Just a,
yes, go ahead.
thank you, Chair Howard, Representative. Just quick clarification. Line 1.6, that's non-payment of rent. Is that just only for those dates of March 13th through September 30th of 2022?
Representative Hassan.
Mr. Chair, yes, Representative, this is only for those specific dates.
Thank you for that clarification.
All right, I'm going to call for the vote on, Mr. Dahl.
Mr. Chair and Representative Nash, I'm very sorry for interrupting you. In fiscal note was requested for the bill. For fiscal note was not for the amendment. That was my mistake for saying that.
Thank you. Moving on to vote. All those in favor of the A2 say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. The motion carries. The bill is amended. We'll go on to member discussion to the bill as amended. Representative Nash, you still want on the bill, or was your question to the amendment? Good. Okay. Not seeing any discussion. Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, Representative Zahn, I understand what you're looking at doing. You're looking at trying to help those who inadvertently one time or maybe 2 times get an eviction. What I'm concerned about those that are multiple times. And this isn't going to help that. That's not going to help the housing providers. It's not going to help the tenants in their facilities, because a lot of times it's not what they're doing in their apartments and causing other problems. It's because they're not paying the rent, which is a lot of times housing providers will use that one instead of damage or criminal activity, because it's easier and it's less offensive to the person that's getting evicted. I think with what's going to happen here is you're going to find out that they're not going to just, they're going to still do the evictions for non-payment, but if there's damage or there's any type of criminal activity, that's also going to be listed on the eviction, so it's just going to make the problem worse. But like I say, I understand what you're trying to do, so we've got to be careful about how we do this, so we don't make a bigger problem out of a small problem.
If I don't see any other discussion, I'll go to Representative Hassan for final comments on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everyone, for the discussion. I will say that there are great landlords, and we're not trying to harm landlords in this bill. We're trying to find a way to remediate the problem between evictions being skyrocketing, and Hennepin County right now can't even keep up with the amount of evictions that are, filed, and the ones that are still in the log that needs to be filed. I want to offer myself and say that I'm willing to work with anybody including the folks from the Multi-Housing Association, to come to some sort of agreement that satisfies all parties involved. I don't want to say that this is just for beneficial to a specific group or specific folks. I'm going to say that this is a problem in statewide everywhere. 90% of evictions are filed because of lack of payment. If that's the case, then we're not, trying to exclude people who are doing criminal activities. We're not trying to exclude people who are, have issues with the law enforcement issues. None of that. What we're saying is that eviction hurts families. It's not cost effective to file eviction, right? It's a lot of money. It's a lot of time wasted. I used to, go to clients to a housing court. Housing court, the clients that are coming to housing court do not have fancy lawyers, but many of the landlords do. And it's, disadvantage to those folks who are coming into court not even knowing what's happening. Before they walk out of there, they have an eviction on their record. So with that, please, I urge you to support. And if you want to work this offline and have conversations, I'm open to that. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members.
With that, I will make the motion that House Bill 647 as amended be laid over for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill. And with that, the bill is laid over. Thank you, Representative Hassan. Next up, we have House File 2055, Representative Cha.
Thank you, Chair Howard. I'd like to move HF 2055 to be laid over for possible inclusion.
Representative Cha has moved the bill and is properly before the committee. Please present your bill.
Thank you, Chair Howard and committee members. I'd like to present HF 2055. This bill creates an exemption for covenants on real property that are created by the declaration or other instrument related to affordable housing when the covenant is required by a government entity. HF 2055 expands the list of exceptions to the 30-year duration limit on housing covenants to include affordability covenants required by government entity. I'd like to turn it over to my testifier, Dan Kitzberger from the MHFA. Thank you.
Mr. Kitzberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, Dan Kitzberger, I'm the Legislative Director at Minnesota Housing, and I'm battling a bit of a cold, so I apologize for my voice. Thank you to Representative Cha for carrying this bill for us. This is a governor's policy recommendation and one we've been trying to get across the finish line for a few years now. Really, the impetus for this is that as part of our multifamily financing work, particularly with federal low-income housing tax credits, our loan documents are able to get to agreements of 40 years. And so this is becoming more of a routine time frame and one that we've agreed to in partnership with our developer partners and stakeholders in the community who have all, kind of prioritized or prioritized together longer terms of affordability and maximizing investments of scarce public resources. And so what we're hoping to do with this bill is add it to a list of exceptions and really avoid kind of the administrative burden of having to come back to the table at year 30 to revisit the covenant that travels with the land, and so we can have timelines that align with the financing of the property itself and the agreement that was made prior to construction. So again, thank you to Representative Cha, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions from members? Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, either to Representative Cha or Mr. Kitzberger. So are we changing this from a 30-year to 40-year, or is this going to be flat out permanent?
Mr. Kitzberger.
Mr. Chair, Representative Johnson, there would be no time frame. It just wouldn't be, it would be no longer limited to 30 years in statute. And so the covenant that's created at the time of the financing as a condition of that financing would then align with the time frame of the affordability requirement in the financing.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, Representative Shaw, so if Minnesota Housing Finance decided to do an 80-year covenant, it lasts for 80 years. If they decided to do a 10-year, it'd be 10 years. If they decided to be a 200-year, it'd be a 200 years. Is that what I'm hearing by this change?
Mr. Kitzberger.
Mr. Chair, Representative Johnson, that decision would have to be made in concert with the entity seeking the financing. So if they were willing to agree to a 200-year affordability requirement, then hypothetically, yes, the covenant could be 200 years long as well.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, I understand the purpose of this, but I think we need to actually put a date certain on it, because at some point, the cost of the building and the repairs, because of the age, the value of the building could go down to the point where it might not be worthwhile to even have any more as housing. So I think we need to have the covenant set to the point where we still have housing available, not just affordable, but all types of housing. And this could actually put a damper on it if we don't have a date certain in statute.
Any other discussion? If not, I will renew the motion that House File 2055 be laid over for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill, and with that, the bill is laid over. Thank you, Representative Shaw and Mr. Kitzberger.
All right, thank you.
Next up, we have Vice Chair Agbaje, Housing Mediation. Vice Chair Agbaje, would you like to move your bill?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
And the bill is moved. Please present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. So this bill, House File 1215, will create a grant program to support housing court mediators around the state. This bill will provide funding to Community Mediation Minnesota to support community dispute resolution programs that are providing certified mediation services to help people resolve housing disputes. These programs use alternatives to the formal judicial system by offering less threatening and more flexible forums for persons of all ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic backgrounds to arrive at a self-determined outcome. The goal of this bill is to achieve more effective and efficient dispute resolution by better implementing mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and restorative practices. Mediation in landlord-tenant disputes is important because it leads us to the broader goal of keeping people in their homes. We know that most landlords and tenants work well together and have good relationships. Yet even the best relationships, sometimes things happen, and having a neutral third party work through conflict on housing issues like non-payment, repairs, disputes between neighbors, and other issues helps to create a beneficial solution that puts the parties back on track and preserve the relationship. A benefit of mediation is that it is a useful tool to prevent evictions. We know that evictions are a disruptive and traumatic event for people and their families. Evictions upend people's lives and unfortunately can lead to job loss, missing out on education, and just be a detriment to physical and mental health. By engaging in mediation, landlords and renters can avoid costly court fees and the detrimental long-term effects of an eviction appearing on a tenant's record. Using mediation will be voluntary, and this bill will allow that option to be more accessible to more people. What this bill does is allocates $2 million in grant funding in both 2023 and 2024 to certified mediation services. In addition to providing support to tenants and landlords, the bill aims to ensure access to culturally specific resolution programs, which is useful for seniors, people of color, and people with disabilities. Some of the partner organizations that CMM works with include the Hmong American Mediation Center and the Center for Multicultural Mediation to provide culturally relevant support. The bill also aims to reduce the need for court actions and costs due to housing conflict. So with that, I have a couple of testifiers, and I'll have them discuss more about the benefits of and the need for more mediation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. First, we have Jen Frisbee with Community Mediation. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Representative Agbaje and the committee. We actually switched the order a little bit. I hope that's not too much trouble. So
No
my
problem.
name is Katie Arnold. I am the Director of Restorative and Mediation Practices. We're located in Rice County, so just outside of the metro. We're a little farther south. And thank you for having us here today. I'm here to kind of discuss the outstate types of programs. And so in Rice County, so I'm a member of the larger entity of Community Mediation Minnesota, which is of the dispute resolution programs. My program in Rice County has, there are about 70,000 people in Rice County. And I just wanted to let you know how important mediation practices are in a county even as small as mine. So with 70,000 people, in 2021, for community services and sessions, we had 25. In conciliation court cases, we had 32. In housing court cases, we had 16. And in our statewide services that are remote around the state through CMM, we had 7, just in my organization alone. In 2022, for community services and sessions, we've already had 6. Court conciliation cases, 7. Housing court cases, 8. And CMM rotation, we've had 2. Now, you can see from these numbers how important mediation is to our community members, the rental providers, the renters, and also the courts rely on our programs as well. But we need to expand our services if possible, and we need money to do that. Statewide, CMM is an important resource in the rental ecosystem. When we served as a CHAP administrator, offering free mediation services to people applying for COVID rental assistance, we received requests from 77 of Minnesota's 87 counties in the first 2 weeks. So moving forward, we need housing solutions that work for both rental providers and the renters. And we aren't just guessing that these are win-win types of solutions, because we know, because we've had over 30,000 housing mediations facilitated by mediators working under the CMM umbrella. We have a timeline issue that this would also address. The eviction process moves faster than the resource process. So we need to address these issues, and mediation can be a really good tool for that. We also know that bad things happen when people don't have conversations, or they have conversations that go poorly. What we can do is we can provide those kinds of constructive conversations as mediators. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. Please introduce yourself for the committee and share with us your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Howard, Representative Agbaje, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about this House File Bill 1215. My name is Bernadette Cathell, and I'm the Executive Director of Mediation and Restorative Services, and we are located in Ano County, and we represent mediators across the state. And we've been around for 35 years, and our work transcends over 40, and we have a collaborative impact piloting and initiating mediation across the state of Minnesota. Since then, mediation and restorative services, one of Minnesota's 6 community dispute resolution programs, have mediated tons of disputes in the thousands, tens of thousands, and this has gone between renters, rental providers, and we are a witness to the harsh realities of the impact of the current housing instability crisis. And I submit that we have a very present parity problem. If Minnesota renters feel like second-class citizens in the state of Minnesota, there are reasons for that. We need to address that. And given that Minnesota holds an unsavory ranking in the nation with the gap between white and black homeownership, we know that homeowners are disproportionately white and renters black. The parity gap between how we support homeowners and how we support renters should be a priority for all. Providing renters and providers with some control over housing disparity is one way of doing that. So what we are here doing today, most importantly, as a collaborative, is to have this bill continue responding in a culturally competent way by providing the necessary funds in a manner that will cure the systemic challenges in housing insecurity in our community. Our goal is to be a proactive part of this process with an approach by coming into the picture upstream. Eviction is usually the first response. It usually takes place of the conversation that needs to happen. We can be brought at the beginning of the process rather than at the end to save the court's time, to take care of record issues, and to ensure that there are not the many lapses and instability problems that we have. This has become very pressing as the moratorium on eviction has lapsed and the state and federal relief funds dry out. We provide an effective speed bump in the process against the deluge of cases, allowing for speedy trials and a more efficient use of judicial resources. We aim to get our court mediation programs a more efficient use of the way that things go out. And we continue to be the first point of contact level triaging cases while providing referral to other crucial services like housing, navigation, and other resource connection services that are usually very, very siloed. These alternatives, among other things, can range from assisting in the resolution of dispute between neighbors, some disputes, domestic dispute in the course of this, consumer merchant dispute in court, as well as school processes, and organization, neighbors, and families, and the crisis in the conflict process that relates to housing instability continues to have a wide, broad spectrum. Our collaborative has a non-coercive dispute resolution forum in the community, providing valuable prevention and early intervention problem-solving resource to the community. The lasting effects of these unprecedented events continue to increase the demands for our services and an ever-increasing need to provide more trainings for our volunteers, for our mediators, for our partners, even in the face of the recently amended Rule 114 that guides this work. Additionally, we are seeing a pressing need for resource connection services due to the varying socioeconomic determinants that border on the competing priorities of our clients. While this bill in place, with this bill in place, community mediation centers will have more resources to reach both property owners and renters across Minnesota and share with them the benefits of mediation. Chair Howard, committee members, there's a tremendous amount of pain on all sides, and I appreciate that you recognize our challenges existed prior to and will continue after the pandemic. The establishment of statewide housing stability mediation grant program is a cost-effective way to support what works, to elevate self-determination and dignity in difficult conversation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be one of the testifiers this afternoon.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to testify on this bill? All right. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name and share your testimony with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Howard, Vice Chair Agbaje, and committee members. My name is Jennifer Frisbee. I am the Housing Program and Finance Director for Community Mediation Minnesota. Today, I would like to provide you with both my personal experience in rental housing, and most importantly, I'm here to share the voices of the people that we work with every day, those people that can't be here to testify. Like many of us who work within our organization, I live with an experience as both a child who struggled with homelessness and as a rental property owner as an adult. At the age of 5, I was loving life as a kindergartner, living in a beautiful rural community. I was a Girl Scout, and I was the sister to 2 brothers, age 1 and 3. Unfortunately, a tragedy hit our family, and my military veteran father became a single dad overnight. Since he was orphaned growing up, he did not have the family support and childcare so he could, maintain his job. And within weeks, he lost his job and we lost our home. We traveled through bus systems throughout the country, sleeping in bus stations, looking for family members that could help us. During that time, I experienced some pretty horrific experiences. I watched children being sex trafficked, as an example. Eventually, we were taken in by Catholic Charities and lived the next 2 years in a monastery, and we were able to heal somewhat. I feel that I was very fortunate with this outcome and my homeless experience, but I recognize that the outcome may have been different had I been born a person of color. As someone who acknowledges my privilege, I often see different outcomes for some of our clients who are 80% people of color and Indigenous. One thing I know for certain is that our work at CMM helps shape better housing outcomes for all Minnesotans. To share a few stories of people that I work with every day. One is a property owner in Scott County who immigrated to the United States. He saved up enough money to buy his first property, and after that, he wanted to buy a second property so he could free up his first property and provide that as a rental unit just to a family in need. Without rent coming in, though, so his first family in his rental unit also hit some hard times and were unable to pay their rent. They were several months behind, and we were able to provide mediation outside of court, and we were able to prevent the eviction being filed in court. They agreed to a solution for everyone, and that saved money and time spent in court. Everyone walked away pretty happy with the outcome. Avoiding court is always the goal, but we often mediate eviction matters in court. Many of these cases stick with me. The case of Ms. Johnson is one that will stick with me forever. She had an eviction hearing at the end of December of 2022 after spending much of the fall in the hospital and in a rehabilitation facility recovering from a traumatic brain injury. In mediation, I offered a safe space for Ms. Johnson to explain her hardship. She admittedly needed time to speak slowly as the brain injury required extra processing time for information. Dialogue between the parties was respectful and compassionate, and the parties were able to find a resolution that worked well for everyone. After mediation, Ms. Johnson reached out to me to express her gratitude. She said that as a Black woman who had spent her career serving others in nonprofit organization, she was feeling hurt by the eviction process before mediation and had been left feeling alone and vulnerable. Ms. Johnson's positive outcome is a result of a pilot project that Community Mediation Minnesota started in Scott County in January of 2022. By July of this year, 2023, however, there is currently no guarantee of funding to allow this work to continue. The judges in Scott County are aware of this and have asked that I share their words of support with you today. Judge Charles Weber asked for me to share the following quote. The question with any program that receives public funding is whether it will lead to concrete results. This is sometimes difficult to demonstrate, leading people to wonder why money is being thrown at something without any evidence that it did any good. This is not and will never be the case with Community Mediation Minnesota. In Scott County, CMM's role has been very straightforward. Provide free mediation services very early in the eviction proceeding in an effort to find a solution that both tenants and landlords can live with. At first, I doubted how effective CMM's efforts would be, but I've become an absolute believer based on the evidence. While I don't have a precise figure, I would estimate that CMM has been able to resolve approximately 80 to 85% of all the eviction cases that its representatives have participated in. That's a tremendous success rate. In short, CMM's mediation efforts have worked because I've seen them work firsthand and often. Again, this is Judge Weber. And I've recommended them to my colleagues in other counties because I believe that this will work anywhere. I strongly support continued funding for CMM's efforts. I'd like to circle back to Judge Weber's estimate on the success rate of mediation in Scott County.
Sorry, Ms. Frisbee, could you conclude soon here? Thank you.
I am. This is my last sentence here.
Thank you.
In fact, the success rate in Scott County during that period was 89%. And this is a model that we have built over the course of the past year, and we're hoping to replicate that model throughout the state of Minnesota. This funding will allow us to do so.
Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for your work.
Yes. And we'll take questions.
Representative Nash, I had you on the list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the author. I thought I heard you say that the spending was in 23 and 24, and yet on in the bill on lines 2.11, it says 24 and 25. Could you clarify that for me?
Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe I just misspoke. Sorry, Representative Nash.
All right.
Representative Nash.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, to the author, in, I think, last year's bill, the funding request was $425,000, and now it's $4 million. Or is it $1 million in the first year and $1 million in the second year, or $2 million per year?
Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Nash. Yes, it has increased to $2 million for each year.
Okay. That's a large increase. Just a little concerned about that, and equally concerned about spending in the tails, which this does. And, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in the tails, and we're going to sign the state up for money that may or may not be present. And we don't know, but we're hearing that there may be an economic downturn, and certainly signing us up for money in the tails is of a deep concern. I get the intent, I really do, but you know me really well. I ask the mechanical questions about process and procedure, and it's troubling that we've gone from what was viewed as a reasonable amount last year at just under $500,000, and now we're looking at $4 million. So I think this is being laid over, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's going to be problematic. I understand the intent, and very compelling story. I would love to find a way to make this work, but that's a lot of money, and it's also a lot of money that we're going to be spending in the tails. So thank you.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, Representative Agbaje. I like the concept of this program. I think it can work. In fact, I know it can work. It's been proven somewhat to work. It looks like this is more of a pilot project that you were getting set up. And I think the program could be very useful. But I have some issues on the mechanics of how it's being set up. Can you tell me, Representative Agbaje, why the administrator of this program is a nonprofit and not MNF, Minnesota Housing Finance Authority?
Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Johnson. Yes, so the Minnesota Housing Finance will be the entity that will distribute the funding. CMM is the organization that has the expertise in mediation and the specialty in mediation, so that's why they were selected as being the use for the funding.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, Representative Agbaje. It somewhat makes sense, but this is state dollars. And I think we have the report on nonprofit organizations and the lack of oversight. I believe Minnesota Housing Finance Authority needs to be much more involved in this to make sure our state dollars are being used for what the purpose is. I think the Minnesota what's the name of the Community Mediation of Minnesota what they've done looks like it's been very good work. They have 5 other affiliates that work with them. And $2 million is only $333,333. If they divide it up equally amongst their affiliates, that won't even cover what they do now. I'm just wondering how we're going to make sure it goes out through the rest of the state. Because the affiliates now are all met, 4 of the 5 are in the metro, and 1 is in Rochester. What's going to happen with Duluth? How are we going to make sure that it goes to Duluth, Bemidji, Grand Rapids? When we get all over this state, there's not much money left. I'm just wondering how, or is this going to be just a pilot program in certain areas to make sure that it's working properly?
Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Johnson. I'll also, do you have further?
I have further
Yeah,
comment.
I'll send it to my testifier for that.
Thank you. Ms. Frisbee.
Thank you. Community Mediation Minnesota is an umbrella organization with the members that you had stated. There are 6 members, and we also have 2 satellite locations. One is in Duluth, and the other is in St. Cloud. Yes, thank you. The CMM works as the organization that brings in the statewide intake, and then we also work with judicial districts that currently do not have services in their district. Once we make those, once we provide that central intake, we use the 6 member organizations to divide out the work. So each member organization receives somewhat of the statewide footprint. Any member organization like Rice County will also receive intake from counties throughout the state of Minnesota. So it's not just located there. CMM is the organization that provides that statewide footprint, provides that centralized intake infrastructure. And yes, do you have a further question about that?
Representative Johnson.
A little bit. Chair Howard, Representative Jay, or to the testifier, with this $2 million per year, and like I say, I think the program's a good program. It can work. About how many cases will that handle?
Representative Agbaje or Ms. Frisbee.
Our current grant with Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, we've had several years of working with highly stringent federal program funding and have done really well with those. In our last grant, we proposed providing 233 housing mediations during a 1-year grant period, and that's just housing mediation. Outside of that, we facilitate other types of conversations, one-on-one conflict coaching, and between those 2 and our entire entity of service providing, we provide approximately 400 types of mediations per year with that funding.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, to the testifier, how many dollars was that for the 400?
Ms. Frisbee.
Yes, so annually our ask is for $2 million.
Anything further, Representative Johnson?
Not at this time. Representative Agbaje, if this moves forward, I'd also wish or ask that you put in reporting requirements to this body so we can do the oversight to see how the program is working.
Representative Nash, I saw you had one other question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I forgot to ask the question of the author for line 2.13. At the end, it says, of this amount, a dollar amount, it's an open-ended appropriation. Can you, I'm assuming we're going to tighten that up, but can you help us understand what that's going to be? Because we talk about that a lot as of late, I think with good cause, but if you could maybe help us out.
Representative Agbaje.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Nash. Yes, so that is for some administrative costs. We're still actually discussing what those will actually be, so we'll find out what that cost is. I've spoken with House Fiscal, and I know that CMM is also in negotiations with MHFA. So we'll have a tighter number for that as this moves forward.
Seeing any other question? Representative Perez-Vega.
Thank you, Chairman Howard. I don't have a question, but I just want to thank Representative Agbaje for bringing up the importance of cultural competency when it comes to what's happening in our renters' facilities, and there may be miscommunication and language barriers. And I just really appreciate highlighting the importance of what we need to bring funding towards that. Gracias.
seeing nothing further, I'll just add a comment of my own, that, we talk about how much this is going to cost a little bit, but I just want to highlight what it's going to save, the ripple benefits that has been described in this testimony. And it really does seem like a program worthy of our consideration and support. So I'll go to Representative Agbaje if she has any final comments on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. I really appreciate the discussion. Again, I would note that this is, I think what the overall will be a tremendous cost saving to both the court system and to landlords and to tenants. This is something where we can ensure that people are having those conversations up front, are resolving those disputes early, and more people can stay in their homes and more landlords can get paid. So thank you, and I look forward to continue to working on this bill.
Thank you. With that, the bill is laid over for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill. And our last bill on the agenda is House File 314. Representative Herr. Welcome back to the committee, Representative Herr. And I will move that House File 314 be laid over for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill. And with that, I will go to your Representative Herr to present your bill.
Thank you, Chair Howard. And I understand that there was an amendment that was submitted for this bill, and I don't know if you want to move the amendment first or just...
Let's present the bill and hear from testifiers, and then we'll move to the amendment, if that's right.
Thank you, Chair Howard. And I would just say that after hearing some of that discussion, I think that my colleagues across the aisle are going to love this bill and vote for it, because I'm not asking for any money and there shouldn't be any appropriations. And so it is just amending current language. So Chair Howard and committee, I'm so glad to be here in front of all of you again. And this bill just is actually is modeled after a similar law in Illinois, which aims to assure that the worst of the worst landlords will be financially responsible when they allow their properties to fall into such disrepair that extreme legal measures are required to ensure the life and safety of the tenants. When this legislation becomes law, we will have a new tool in the toolbox to ensure the stability of renters and the maintenance of dilapidated properties. Under current law, a court can appoint a third-party administrator to make court-approved life and safety repairs when a landlord ignores a court order to keep their property up to code and habitable for their tenants. This bill simply ensures that those court-appointed administrators have access to the capital needed to make those costly repairs, and to do so in a way that ensures that the landlord is financially responsible to pay that debt. As you will hear from testifiers, without this legislation, we are leaving some of the most at-risk tenants with no options other than enduring uninhabitable living conditions or displacement. And Chair Howard, that is actually just overview of the bill and some thoughts around that. But do you want me to go ahead and move to the testifiers?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Let's go first to Ellen Solly, President of Family Housing Fund. Welcome to the committee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear in front of the committee. As mentioned, I'm Ellen Solly. I'm president of the Family Housing Fund. The Family Housing Fund is a nonprofit organization building on a 43-year legacy of helping communities address their housing challenges. And complementing the state's investment in housing, we have brought an additional $250 million of private capital that supports the kinds of investments that you're also making. I'm here to speak in favor of House File 314. This proposed legislation will address poor quality rental housing where a property owner has refused to remedy longstanding health and safety building code violations, and I'm deeply appreciative of Representative Herr's leadership on this important issue. We know rental property owners play an important role in the housing market. We know from our work that most renters have positive experiences with their landlord. And we know most landlords are responsible and make necessary repairs when their renters bring problems to their attention. But there are extreme cases where rental property owners repeatedly fail to address health and safety issues that are required by building code. Under the current system, some renters live in properties owned or operated by this small group of unscrupulous owners, and they must endure substandard housing because renters, communities, and local government lack tools to truly hold the current rental property owner responsible financially. House File 314 adds a tool in our toolbox to ensure current rental property owners are financially responsible for paying for the required repairs and doing so in a timely fashion. The proposed legislation allows a court-ordered administrator appointed through the Tenant Remedies Action provision in Minnesota Statute 504B to make health and safety repairs on rental property and recover the costs for those repairs by recording a lien against the property in a priority position. This proposed legislation includes a provision that ensures lien holders are noticed at the time of the initial TRA hearing to ensure that the lender has an opportunity to engage to resolve the health and safety issues that are before the body. And finally, this proposed legislation removes the economic viability provision, which ensures that rental property owners comply with the covenants of habitability that exist as a result of leasing rental units in exchange for money. This proposed legislation is modeled after a state of Illinois statute, which was passed more than 20 years ago. This statute has empowered local government and third parties who pay for repairs in these situations to recover those costs from property owners as a lien on the property that is superior to all liens. The solution is timely, the impact on renters and community is minimized, and the housing stock is protected because the rental property owner is required to maintain it in a manner required by law. It's also important to note that this proposed legislation is an optional tool that could be available to help resolve outstanding health and safety issues in TRA cases when an owner has repeatedly failed to act. It is not a new requirement for local government or the court. And to be clear, we're not here today to talk about typical landlords and typical requests for repairs made by renters. We are here to talk about rare and egregious scenarios of unresponsive landlords who are outliers in their industry and renters who are confronted with a hard choice between remaining in unhealthy homes and homelessness. We are here to talk about a solution for those renters and for the local governments working to protect the safety of their rental housing stock and the stability of their constituents. So to summarize, the proposed legislation amends existing statute to allow for a priority lien when a court-ordered administrator is charged with resolving extreme health and safety rental property conditions after the rental property owner has blatantly ignored directives to repair conditions. It requires notification to lien holders to allow the lender to step in and protect the property from further deterioration. It ensures that the state's safety and habitability standard is not negotiable, and it allows for reasonable tenant attorney's fees in such habitability cases. In closing, some policy changes are impactful because they provide an impact for a large number of people. This proposed legislation affects a small number of people in a very significant way, and I ask for your support.
Thank you. Next, we have Alex Dibski, Director of Lighthouse Management. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, distinguished committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear in front of you today. My name is Alex Dibski. I'm a director with Lighthouse Management Group. Lighthouse has served as court-appointed administrator on several occasions and as receiver and other judicial appointments in hundreds of proceedings. I'm here today to speak to relevant situations regarding House File 314. As noted, Lighthouse has served as court-appointed administrator. These cases often involve significant code violations, including lack of repair and habitability, contentious litigation, landlord cooperation challenges, and limited funds available to accomplish an effective administratorship. In particular, I'd like to highlight the cases of IX of Corcoran versus Equity Residential Holdings and Stephen Friends, as well as IX of North Minneapolis versus Mahmoud Khan. And if I take a brief step back on administratorship appointments, what is the goal and framework of an administrator? We go in, we meet with all of the relevant parties, landlords, tenants, third-party vendors, city inspectors. We develop an action plan. This includes identifying the repairs that need to be addressed, along with implementing a competitive bid process from contractors to perform those repairs. We review all of the financial statements and develop a budget, and we maintain ongoing operations. This includes maintaining existing leases, but also taking steps on lease-up opportunities to maximize the value of these properties. This plan is submitted to the court for review and approval, To the extent that additional funding is needed as part of this action plan, we identify that and submit that to the court for review and approval as well. Once we receive that court order, we execute on that plan and provide on an ongoing basis full transparent reporting, both operational and financial updates. Very briefly, the two cases I'm talking about today. The first is Equity Residential Holdings. In July of 2019, Lighthouse was appointed as administrator. This included 5 properties and approximately 69 units. One of the first steps we undertook was a unit-by-unit inspection with property management and the city of Minneapolis. We identified significant emergency violations that needed to be remedied. This included smoke detectors, defective electrical and HVAC, plumbing, heating, securing external doors, and window replacements. As part of this analysis, we identified that $84,000 would be needed upfront in order to effectuate those repairs and discharge the orders as stipulated by the court. This compared to $30,000 per month in rent collections. When we extrapolated that out, once the repairs were made and lease or occupancies reached 75 to 100%, we estimated that annual rent would be $500,000 to $650,000. Between the $84,000 needed for repairs and an additional $20,000 needed for unpaid utilities, we seeked approval from the court to access $150,000 from the city of Minneapolis to effectuate those repairs and pay unpaid utility bills. This was approved by the court. The funds were received during the fourth quarter of 2019. All of the repairs were made in concert with the city inspector's office. The $150,000 was then repaid through free cash flow generation from the properties and repaid in full in concert with the sale of these properties in the spring of 2020. One important caveat of this proceeding and case was at the outset, Lighthouse indicated we'd be unable to serve as administrator if there were not adequate funds in order for us to discharge our duties. Similarly, in the Mahmoud Khan case, Lighthouse was appointed in December 2017. This appointment included 42 properties. During our analysis, and oftentimes we ensure insurance is adequately covering the properties, we identified a loan or an encumbrance on 3 of the properties with U.S. Bank. We immediately notified the lender of the situation and took every action possible to ensure that those mortgages remained current. Given the magnitude of the repairs in the Khan case, we had to triage those into 2 phases. Keep in mind this was during the winter months and it included furnace replacements because there was inadequate heat, water heater replacements, water meter installations, frozen pipes. The list went on and on. Phase 1 repairs were estimated at $130,000. Phase 2 repairs were estimated at $69,000. This compared to monthly rent collections of $30,000 to $50,000. As part of this, we sought approval from the courts to tap into $150,000 from the city of Minneapolis. We also sought approval from the courts to be able to use the collateral to secure a $125,000 loan against the properties. Both of those funding mechanisms were approved by the court. The $275,000 in conjunction with the additional rent that was collected over the time frame allowed Lighthouse to operate and manage these properties for 5 months. That was adequate time to determine what properties would be viable over a longer time horizon, where tenants could remain residing in those units. Those units that would not have been viable for an extended time frame, it provided us ample time to transition them to alternative housing. So just to summarize sort of our experiences and findings, Lighthouse has determined that administratorships oftentimes can be insolvent, and there needs to be a mechanism to ensure that we're able to discharge our duties. We obtained our funding through adequate notice and in conjunction with court approvals. We leveraged the city and third-party experts for our reviews and repairs. All of this allowed the tenants to remain in their homes until new housing was identified or the operations were stabilized. One final thought I want to put in here is, in many ways, I take a similar lens as I do with receiverships as I do with administratorships. And one of the primary goals of Statute 576 related to receiverships is the preservation and protection of assets. In the case of these administratorships, we're not looking to rehab these properties into something grandiose. Our goal is very clear. We have specific repairs ordered by the city and the court. We need the funding and a mechanism in order to do so, so that we can discharge those duties. And similarly with a receivership, the administrative expenses in order for a receiver to discharge their duties have a priority status among all other creditors to ensure there is a third-party independent neutral that's able to accomplish that. Thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We will move to the amendment. There's an A1 amendment. Representative Johnson, are you offering the A1 amendment? Or Representative Myers?
Yep. Thank you, Chair Nelson. Thank you, Representative Herb. Thank you, testifiers. You know, there's a lot of information going out there. You know, what I'm trying to do here is just make sure that with this amendment that the, notice is going out to interested parties. So we had put in there about registered and certified mail. Additionally, we did talk about tools in the toolbox, and I want to ensure that those, we're not doing something that's going to restrict the financial funding for some of these options. So this amendment would also remove that lien priority status. And then finally, it would, put back in there the economic viability of the building so that we're making sure that, if we're talking about a building that's so dangerous and so, needs to be condemned or abandoned, that we're not, putting funds into those type of buildings. So I'm hoping, Representative Herr, you're willing to, look at some of these, have a little bit of a conversation.
Representative Herr.
Mr. Chair, and thank you for bringing the amendment. Truthfully, I appreciate your explanation, but what this amendment does is actually guts the entire bill and actually renders it not really effective at all. And to be honest, I've actually seen this. I've talked to the banks and the credit unions who brought this forward, and we've had conversations. And unfortunately, between the advocates and them, this amendment or the language that was presented actually never got responded to after the advocates sent their concerns about it. And so I'm disappointed that this is kind of where it went to, and then an amendment was just offered, considering that people were talking to each other. So I would just ask the committee to actually vote down this amendment, and that I will continue to work with those who are against the bill and those who are for it on some language that might be more agreed upon by all parties. So at this point, I'd ask for just a no vote on the amendment.
Representative Myers.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. Representative Herr, would you be willing to answer our question?
I can't, about this bit, about the amendment or about just the bill in general?
About the amendment.
Go ahead, Representative Myers.
So do you see any issue with, again, talking about that toolbox, that giving the priority over to, away from the people that have provided the initial mortgage, that it may lead to some restrictions for financial options for additional housing? We talk a lot in here to make sure funds are available so that we can put shovels in the ground and we can keep people in their homes. Are you open to discussing that type of language?
Representative Herr.
I'm always open to any suggestions that are given. I do just want to state that these scenarios don't happen all the time. They're actually quite, not common. And so the institutions that are holding the mortgages for these particular properties, my thought has been that they actually have more levers already than an individual who actually lives in a unit, especially when you don't have the privilege or the ability to actually just go to another unit, and that you are then investing in figuring out how to stay in this place. And so the individuals who this priority lien is actually supporting, they're the ones who actually need to have more tools because of the way the system is set up. And so though I am, I want our financial institutions to be healthy and available to continue to give out loans, that the number of institutions that would be impacted by this based on the number of cases, that it actually would be quite limited. So if you have something that can address that, and I would be more than open to that.
Representative Myers.
Representative Herr, and I appreciate you saying that. And I appreciate you saying that it happens in rare situations. What I would like to do is continue this conversation, if you would do that. That being said, I would then withdraw the amendment.
Amendment has been withdrawn. I saw Representative Nash on the list here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Herr, I don't think I have her full attention. There we go. Representative Herr, you said in your intro that you think we're going to really like this because Illinois is doing it. And I would remind everyone that 4 of the last 10 Illinois governors went to prison, so not always our best model to go after. I have some problems with it. I have talked to a lot of the bankers in my district, and having them take effectively second position and have a junior lien holder move to the front of the line is very disturbing, because if the repairs that ultimately get made then surpass the value of the mortgage and the value of the property, then they're left holding the bag and they've got nothing. So I'm hope this is being laid over, I think. I just think that this is a really misguided approach to this. Again, in a very extreme circumstance, is what you said. I think we have the ability to do that in our current toolbox now, since we're talking about the tools we have available to us. But I just know that community banks are the lifeblood of our communities, and when we pass a bill to effectively destabilize their ability to continue doing what they're doing, I take great umbrage with that. I have served my community for a long time, both as city council and mayor, and now state rep, and I just look at this as something that is going to really put them in an unstable position on these properties where they may be currently the first position lien holder. Leapfrogging that makes it so that they could potentially have nothing left over after the end of these proceedings. That seems very punitive to me, and that it's a very heavy-handed approach. I understand, because having been mayor, we did have to intervene with folks who had, there was one building that was literally falling in on itself, and we had to try to pursue some things, and there was no mortgage on that, but if there was, then actions that we took would have been, if your bill were to become law, would have destabilized the first position lien holder. So I can't support this, even though you compelled us with the luring things from Illinois. I don't ever want to be Illinois or California, but I can't support this, and I think that it really takes just a very heavy-handed approach and is very anti-bank. So thank you.
Representative Purdy, do you have a comment?
Yes, thank you, Chair Howard, and thank you, Representative Nash, for the questions. I just want to make a couple of corrections. I didn't actually say you would like this bill because Illinois did it. I said you'd like the bill because it wasn't asking for any money. And so I just want to make sure for the record that that is the case. I also want to say that, we can always talk about what if scenario, and we can talk about, well, what if the costs are more than the value of the property? And the truth is that we have somebody here who actually walked through the process of what they're looking at for the cost. And I would maybe just defer to my testifier to say that if you were in a situation where the repairs would greatly exceed the value of the property, I guess, if you could maybe speak to that a little bit, what would happen in those situations?
Mr. Dibski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So specifically in the Mahmoud Khan case, we did deem those properties not economically viable. So we had to devise or develop a plan in which we identified which of the units were viable over a longer time horizon, make the repairs in those. The other properties, because the repairs, the amount of money we would have needed was significant in order to bring all 42 properties into, call it a 10 to 15 year viable time horizon. We reported to the court that is not something that would be prudent. We needed to have an action plan where we had immediate funds to ensure that people were not getting injured or potentially dying because of the conditions of those properties. It allowed us time then to transition them to alternative housing. So it did limit the scope of the amount of funds we were asking for, and in particular was very specific to the code violations and emergency repairs as dictated by the city of Minneapolis.
Mr. Chair, so I would just state that no one is going to be making irrational, illogical decisions around properties. What I would just state also that as much as we worry about the banks and the credit unions, I actually have very good relationships with them. I visit a bunch of them. I actually go to their, anytime they have events, because that is my background is in financial institutions. And so what I would also urge is that if we are worried about them, maybe we should be worried about banks doing a better job investigating whom they're providing loans to ensure that they don't finance slum loans. I think that that's probably a better use of our time in saying, how do we ensure that people are making good loans, right? And so if we're worried about that, we should probably be looking at that process as well.
I did have a question. We've talked about the notion that they're rare, and we have two pretty substantial, I remember in both of these cases were in the news and in the media. But when we're talking rare, do you have a sense of what we're talking about in terms of quantity of times that this situation has sort of come up in Minnesota in recent history?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So this is more anecdotally. We've had dozens of appointments as administrator. These are the only two in which we've sought to have funds. Typically, when we're involved in a receivership or an administratorship as it relates to multifamily housing, we try to develop a plan where the rent roll itself is sufficient to effectuate the repairs, and continue ongoing operations until there's a resolution with the litigation. So these are obviously two cases that received a lot of media attention. We are involved in a smaller case right now where there might be a need to have additional funding made available up front. But in our experience, it is rare.
Representative Nash, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just pointing out that if we're going to pass a bill for two instances, I think that we could probably let the normal circumstances take their course rather than have to go through the legal process of creating new statute to address those. So, thanks.
Representative Petersburg, did you?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, I'm going to kind of key in on the same part because the two examples that were used were quite large multi-use facilities. But if we're dealing with a duplex or a quadplex, it makes it a lot more difficult to do the fundraising. I mean, the cash flow in order to do it. And understanding that over the last 3 or 4 years, landlords and those that have had properties like this have been under extreme pressure because of some of the mandates and moratoriums on rent collections as well, making it much more difficult to do that. And my concern isn't whether or not there's a lien or whether or not properties need to be taken care of. It's the fact that it's a priority lien in which it goes ahead of banks that have loaned the dollars in good faith and now are finding themselves behind. I'm not sure that even qualifies for, and I could be wrong, but even in bankruptcy, I think first mortgage is still held as first mortgage, no matter what. And so this is a really, in my opinion, as an example that you mentioned, in which you had to tell properties that had to be sold or reconfigured, that really is a state-sanctioned confiscation of property, which I think is something dangerous for us to get into. And so my big concern is primarily with the priority lien, not necessarily a lien. And so maybe there's some other ways in which you can figure that out. But once that goes into that part of it, mortgage companies that may have provided this mortgage 5, 10 years ago is now finding themselves in second position. And I'm sure that's not what they want either. So thank you for your consideration.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, Representative Herr, I understand what you're trying to do here. Trying to make sure that the rental property is in good condition and safe, which is very admirable. They should be. One thing that we did learn that it's, I'm not sure, the two cases that you brought, how many years have they been in to the testifier?
Mr. Dibski.
Just seeking clarification, Mr. Chairman, what years were the appointments? Mr. Chairman, Representative, the appointments for Mahmoud Khan range from 2017 through 2018, and in the equity residential Stephen Friends proceeding, there are multiple appointments, but the one referenced today was 2019 through 2020.
Representative Johnson.
Chair Howard, members, it's from 2017 to now is 5+ years. That's just two events that we're looking at. Two major events. There's more than likely some smaller ones that didn't have to go to the, as he said, to the point where they had to go figure out financing and stuff like that. But it doesn't happen, I don't believe it happens that often. One time is too many, but it doesn't happen that often. One concern I do have is the repealer. Because as the testifier stated, they looked at the condition of the buildings, how much it was going to cost to get them up to speed. And in the current law, they had the opportunity to say, no, the costs were too great compared to the value of the building. The repealer takes that away. With that gone, there's no option but to maybe spend hundreds of thousands of dollars repairing a building that's not worth that. So that's a concern. That's why I think we need that repealer taken away, to make sure that the judge can look at the equity of the building and the value and say, okay, this needs to be condemned, and the city or whoever can raise the building, and we can look at getting some type of new affordable housing in there that's up to date and have all the standards, and we make sure it's safe. The other issue I have is currently most cities have licensing and inspection requirements of rental units. I don't know how often they're doing the inspections, but I'm sure if a tenant would call the city and say, we have a problem here, we've talked to the housing provider and they're not taking care of the issue, please come and take a look. The inspector would go there, find the problem, say, yes, this is a problem, or no, this isn't a serious problem now, but we'll talk to the landlord or the property owner and start working out a plan to get this fixed. If it's a serious issue, they might tell them they have to get it fixed right away, or your license might get suspended or revoked. Or if he doesn't fix it right away, they might start the process to get it into receivership and start getting the work taken care of. We have a process in place now. Is this going to make it any better? I don't think so, not with the priority lien. It's going to make it worse. Because once it goes into receivership, and the testifier even said, they'd contact the lien holders, try to work out a plan with them even, to work things out to try to get the problem resolved. I think a lot of times these are going to be on small duplex and single-family homes or quadplexes, where I think it's going to be even worse because the property owner probably doesn't have the resources a large corporation has with a multiple units. And so we have to look at the whole thing in completely, and I think this, I don't think is the right way to go, and as Representative Nash said, if Illinois does it, I'm skeptical. So I think I would like to represent her, if we can work together to try to get something out that if there is a real serious problem with the current law, I would love to work with you to try to fix it. But at this time, you haven't proven to me that we do have a real problem with the current law. So with that, I believe we're going to be laying this over, so I'll end there.
Representative Herr, any final comments on the bill?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. And I thought Representative Johnson and I were almost going to get to a place where we'd agree and that I would relook at the repealer, but then he said, doesn't even matter because the priority lien is the issue. So I would love to maybe, have a conversation about the repealer because I think that's something I'd be willing to take a look at. But I just want to be really clear with this committee that there's actually since this bill has been introduced, there's already been concessions made by advocates that in the 3 years, we've included disclosure provisions to ensure lenders know that their properties are in distress. And we also, stripped out the requirements for economic feasibility analysis because we believe that avoiding displacement of tenants is worth the cost. It will always be a better financial bet than replacing condemned properties. And so, there's concessions that have already been made. So we're willing to compromise on this. But I also just want to say really quick that if the argument to be made is that it's so many few properties and it doesn't even matter and we should just let it play out, then we shouldn't matter that it is a priority lien and that some other person who should be in line to get the money first, that should matter either, right? It's like, so you could just reverse the argument and it would be the same. And so if it's not a big deal to you and this should just play out, then it shouldn't be a big deal for those who are opposing this and just let it, for us to change this and let that play out too. And I just want to be very clear that it has already been established that we keep having conversations about small projects and the testifier has actually laid out which properties this has impacted. And so for us to remember that we don't get to make up our own facts, that somebody is telling us what properties are being impacted by this. And I would just say that for the last bit of this is, it may not matter to some of us because we have such privilege in being able to be mobile and going to different places and renting a new house or renting a new facility. But the people who are living in these facilities, It's only a few people, but it has huge major impacts on them. They don't have the same privileges we do. They don't have the same access to capital and resources as we do. And so if we do care about those who are the most marginalized within our communities, we should care about those who are being taken advantage in their housing. With that, Chair Howard, I would love for this committee to consider this bill and include it in your omnibus. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fer. So with that, I'll renew my motion that House File 314 be laid over for possible inclusion in an omnibus bill, and with that, the bill is laid over. Members, tomorrow we have 6 bills on the calendar, and we were given an extra hour. I don't know if we'll need it, but we have that ability tomorrow to go an extra hour since we missed a hearing during the mini snowpocalypse. I don't know if it's quite a full-on snowpocalypse, but with that, I'm sorry, sir. If it's very quick, sir.
There you go, thank you. Members of the committee, Chair Howard, thank you very much. I'm Mark Hughes. I happen to be in a construction business, know a little bit about rental properties. I do support this bill because if you look at the numbers in St. Paul, even though it really should go statewide, the numbers in St. Paul are that more people now rent than own, where it used to be more people owned than rent, that those numbers have flipped now. And if you remember on the news probably less than a couple weeks ago, we had a thing called the Ramsey House that Mo Sharif owned from the downtowner. And he owned it for a long time, but it was becoming uninhabitable because there was so much work that had to be done on it. They were afraid it would fall over. But then the Preservation Committee in St. Paul got involved and put an injunction to stop all that. He had a permit to go with Camish and Sons to demolish it, and we had to get the mayor involved, and he said, go ahead and demolish it. And finally, they came to an agreement where the city of St. Paul gave an unforgivable loan for a while. Another attorney bought it, moved it down West 7th Street, took it apart piece by piece, and we settled the argument. But that thing, if you remember the history, was in the 1930s, some restaurant employees lived there and then worked right down the street. But it was a really small house, and there was a lot of free information about it. But because of its safety, it really had to come down. But I just wanted to point out that there are more houses for rent now in St. Paul than people own, and that's all I got to say. I'm not going to say, but I support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And with that, we will see folks tomorrow. The committee is adjourned.